Shortly after filming this Q&A, a DW team came under Russian artillery attack while filming military exercises in the Donbas region. Cameraman Yevgen Shilko was injured by a piece of shrapnel, but is in stable condition.
You're obviously never going to just walk up to a frontline position unaccompanied and get into the trench unannounced and say hi and start filming. That's just not going to happen.
These are places where people lose their lives every day. So that's a big risk that journalists take when they go to these places.
In this video, we'll be talking to two of our Ukraine correspondents. We have Nick Connolly in Kyiv and Ibrahim, who has just returned from Ukraine. And both of them have been reporting on the counteroffensive, which is going on in Ukraine right now. We will talk about that in just a minute. My name is Max Sander. I'm a DW correspondent myself and have been going in and out of Ukraine since the beginning of the war. Last time has been quite a while, 2 months so far, so I'm quite curious of what the situation is there on the ground, how the counteroffensive is going, and what the situation there is for reporters such as us at the moment. And so is our audience, as we can see from the comments on YouTube. So we have collected some questions for you guys, and before we dive into this, maybe you guys can give us a brief update on what your latest work in Eastern Ukraine has been, or what have you been focusing on in your last reporting trips? Maybe we can start with you, Nick.
So we went to the south and southeast of the country, Zaporizhia, Donetsk. Sometimes it's pretty difficult to get there. There's lots of areas that are out of bounds where the Ukrainian military press services won't let you go, but we did manage to get to quite a few frontline positions.
Yeah, you've just returned from recently liberated villages in Eastern Ukraine. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I was in an area pretty much around the same area that Nick was in. He spoke to soldiers and had a chance to be really on frontline positions. And I was able to speak to some civilians that were in the area, which I think is always really interesting to get the perspective of people who actually live through this and are not soldiers. So in that sense, I think between the reporting that both of us did, we have a pretty good idea about what this feels like on the ground.
If I'm doing the math correctly, the war in Ukraine will have lasted 1.5 years next month. How are the troops' morale? This is something another follower is asking. How are soldiers doing right now?
I've heard tired, exhausted, but I've never really heard, at least in my experience, someone say that they don't want to continue. And so far, from their perspective, Ukrainians have been very good at putting up a resistance that many people didn't really think would happen, and that's a huge source of motivation and for them to keep going. But obviously, you're dealing also with a population that has been through a lot of loss. I think it was in a report that you did, Max, that there was a man who said, there are these guys that you're smoking with one day, and then the second day they're gone.
Страшно, и думаешь ты и о десятках тысяч погибших, и о тех ребят, которые были, блядь, вечером с тобой курили сигарету, и их за пару часов нет. Думаешь, каждый день думаешь.
Nick, you've been following the story for us from the very beginning. Have you experienced or witnessed any changes in terms of morale since the very beginning?
I think people are exhausted, and it really depends how much leave they're getting. Some units, you get the sense people have been able to come out and have a few longer stays, because the normal 2-week stay, most people will tell you, is just not enough to come down.
Потім я з'їздив додому, жінка потрапила в лікарню з апендицитом. Це 2. Третій раз я був 2 місяці назад, на 5 днів. І сьогодні я їду в Київ. Вчора загинув мій брат під Луганськом, то це 4-й раз, що я буду в Києві за 1,5 року.
You might physically be at home, but mentally they're still in the trenches. And it takes longer than that to really be able to get back into civilian life and to pay attention to the kind of daily details of life that are important for the families back home, but that seem totally irrelevant when you're coming from a war zone where people are dying every day. But when you speak to them, I think the alternative, looking for some kind of negotiated settlement with Russia, some kind of freezing of the conflict, that just doesn't appeal to the vast majority of soldiers you talk to. But they say all that will happen is that Russia will restock its army, will rebuild its forces, and will take another bite at Ukraine. They don't believe that there is a negotiated settlement, that Russia will leave Ukraine alone. And so there's a sense of needing to carry this on until Ukraine has regained all of its territory while that Western support is still there.
We have another rather technical question coming from Simon Yang, who was asking us, or asking you guys rather, how well is Russian fortification and how many casualties did Ukraine take? It's probably a rather difficult, if not impossible, question to answer. What do you think, Nick?
Casualty numbers basically don't exist. There are periodic, very rare announcements by the Ukrainian side saying we've now passed so and so many thousand deaths. But the last one I can remember that was really credible was months ago. There are obviously numbers that the Ukrainians publish about what they say are the Russian losses, and the Russians do the same for what they claim to be Ukrainian losses. But I think we'll only really know the true figures after the war. There's still lots of people also who are deemed to be unaccounted for, missing in action rather than confirmed dead. As for the fortifications, it does seem like the Russians made use of the time they had before Ukraine received the Western weapons it was asking for so long, and just planted these huge minefields. There is no option to drive around them. You have to find a way to drive through them. That is to send people to demine while they're being shot at, to clear a path and then drive your tank through that. So I think there is a sense that lots of the kind of Western military planners are just confronting a reality that is just totally beyond their expectation.
You want to add to that, Aya?
The soldiers that I've spoken to, they constantly say, this is really difficult.
У них тоже стоят в обороне. Ну, они далеко недооцененные тоже ребята на самом деле. С ним не так-то просто воевать. Я бы не сказал, что мы идем очень медленно. Почему мы идем медленно? Мы хорошо идем, хороший шаг. Ну, если мы будем говорить, что быстро пройти, это то же самое, как они сказали, что Киев за 3 дня. Это будут те же самые просто слова.
I've also spoken to a military doctor who said something that really stayed with me.
Поранений, коли поступає до нас, перше, що ми чуємо, ми ще не бачимо пораненого. Його тільки перегружають з машини, але ми вже його чуємо. Він дуже сильно кричить.
There's definitely a sense that there's a lot of pressure coming from the outside on Ukraine's army, and the soldiers there are just, and perhaps even authorities are just not willing to take the kind of casualties, drastic casualties of human lives that maybe Russia was willing to take to, for example, maintain a place like Bakhmut, which just lasted for months and months and involved probably lots of casualties and some very, very ugly warfare.
In my experience, lots of people are, when they find out we're working on stories or we're reporting from Ukraine, here in Germany or other places, they're always quite curious of how much access do we get, what is it like working with the military. And it's also something that apparently our followers are also quite interested in. Lance's Armor Striking is asking whether you were on a guided tour, Aya. Were you free to move around the village and talking to the locals when you were doing your last shoot there? What was that like?
I mean, there's no way to go about it. We are embedded with military personnel when we go to these places. And it's the same as if you were embedded with a military in Iraq or in Afghanistan or wherever. You're getting, I mean, they're choosing where you go a lot of the time. And so you're getting a version of the story that is, to a certain extent, filtered through their perspective. In some areas, we're not allowed to go without them. These are not places where just anyone would have access to. And there are also situations like the newly liberated villages, places that were heavily mined. So there's a real security reason to have them come with us. It's about trying to be safe and not just simply because we wouldn't get access without them. With that being said, I haven't, in my experience so far, felt censored by a military spokesperson. I've always had a chance to ask whatever I wanted to ask. When it comes to civilians, I will say that we didn't really tell our military officer about the civilians that we were going to meet with that day. in these areas, we had independently got in touch with them ourselves. And we wanted to meet with a particular volunteer, and they really didn't seem to have an issue with that.
I agree with everything you said there. I think you have to kind of distinguish between, on the one hand, military positions. You're obviously never going to just walk up to a frontline position unaccompanied and get into the trench unannounced and say hi and start filming. That's just not going to happen. So often enough, the motivation is just that they don't want us to come to harm, and then that to be their problem and them to get in trouble from the authorities in Kiev, who are worried about the security of international journalists. And I think, I'm very conscious of the fact that we are privileged and we are protected in a way that not all journalists are, especially local journalists. But that also obviously means that maybe because they're more worried about looking after us, that we maybe don't get some access. That there are, for instance, Ukrainian journalists who drive around Donbass on quad bikes, and they avoid the checkpoints, go past the official routes, and obviously at huge risk to their own health, but do that to get stories that maybe you wouldn't get if you're doing things according to the kind of official algorithm. I haven't really had the sense that they are trying to kind of stage manage our visits or kind of create a narrative and feed us something. I speak Ukrainian, I speak Russian, I can understand what's going on around me, I can speak to people. I haven't had anyone either tell me not to ask a question or something.
Let me just follow up on that. What you said earlier about access being granted by the Ukrainian military. There's another user who is touching on OPSEC, operational security. It says OPSEC always makes it difficult to allow journalists complete freedom of movement. Are we, the Western public, getting the full and correct story? What would you respond to that, Nick?
I don't think that there is ever a full 360-degree view of any war. I think that just is illusory to think that is possible. There's definitely a lot more coming out of the Ukrainian side than from the Russian side. And also we can't go to the Russian side because Deutsche Welle isn't accredited with the Russian authorities. And historically, this was the issue all down the years. When I came here in 2017, we obviously tried to get to Donetsk, get to those so-called People's Republics, to those Russian proxies there in eastern Ukraine, and they consistently didn't let Western press in.
You mentioned the next topic pretty much that our followers are very interested in is reporting on the Ukrainian, but also on the Russian side pretty much. So another question that came up is, have you had the opportunity to speak to Russian soldiers? What have they been told by their government, and how do they feel about this quote-unquote whole thing?
I've done a lot of stories about people that grieve the loss of their loved ones because of this war. Mothers, wives, sons, daughters.
Знаєте, я познайомилася з ним, коли мені було 15 років, і зараз мені 35, і я не перестала захоплюватися ним. Це найжахливіше, що могло відбутися в цьому житті. Коли я чіпляла його портрет на цю стіну.
And I would love to hear, to speak to a Russian mother, for example, about what it feels to have lost, a son or a daughter to this war, which is, an unnecessary one. We just don't have that kind of access. DW was kicked out of Russia shortly before the full-scale invasion, and our colleagues who worked at that bureau, at the Moscow bureau, are now running their Russia bureau in exile in Riga, and they have their sources and try as best as they can with the resources that they have to try and understand what is going on in Russian society right now because of this war. And so we do cover Russia, but not in the same way that we are covering Ukraine, and that's simply access that we have no control over whatsoever.
And I'd also just like to point out, lots of Ukrainian media regularly go to camps where Ukrainian prisoners of war are kept, and I think that's very difficult for ethical reasons. These are people who can't say what they want to say. They are captives, and that you can see that basically none of the kind of quality international media pick these stories up because they have exactly those same ethical concerns.
Were there a lot of risks or dangers involved when you guys were reporting at the front lines? What are the scariest moments that you guys recall? And I remember from both of you guys there, as you've actually captured some of them on screen. You can start with you, Aya.
These are places where people lose their lives every day. So that's a big risk that journalists take when they go to these places. With that being said, we obviously do go there responsibly, and there are a number of things and measures that we take that mitigate these risks as much as we possibly can. And so one of them is that we're all trained. We have security training before anybody's sent to a place like that they, go through to know how to act in a situation like this. We also have colleagues. So, even though we as reporters are often the only ones on camera, we do go there as a collective team, and it is a collective effort. And part of that team is also a security advisor and colleagues that speak the language and know the area much better than we do. I think for me, the scariest thing is really the sound of incoming shelling. As Russian troops retreated, they mined the whole village.
Finish. We're going.
The time between you hear that whistle of a shell coming in and when you actually hear the bang where it's landed and know that it's landed somewhere and that place is not immediately close to you, these are a very tricky few seconds.
Nick, you have been reporting nonstop on this pretty much since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. How do you avoid getting used to the risk, getting used to the dangers? How do you still keep your guard up over such a long time?
I think the dangers are often maybe slightly different to the ones that people might expect. So yes, incoming shelling is obviously a danger, but mines are, to my mind, the bigger deal, because it doesn't necessarily have to be on the active front line. It can be after a reporting trip. It can be as simple as someone wanting to use the bathroom and there not being a bathroom, going somewhere off the road. And this can be places that have not seen active fighting for months, but were mined. No one really has a real idea of where those mines were laid. They were all, often laid in quite some haste. Car accidents, people just having to work too long hours. You're meeting the military early in the morning. Often you're having to, wait hours and hours before you finally get to film something, and just overtiredness leading to car accidents. I think that is also a very acute risk. The intensity is totally different now than what we saw pre-February 22.
So when you do actually leave Kiev and go to the front lines, this is another thing a user is asking: how do the soldiers and civilians, how do they meet your presence? How do they feel about you being there?
In terms of the soldiers, often it really depends on the unit. So some you get the sense that they've had enough and they don't want to be prodded and to be asked and to be made to reflect on the dangers and the difficulties of being far away from home, far away from their families. Other times you get the sense actually it's a nice distraction from being stuck underground in a trench with the same three people. There's sometimes it feels a bit like boarding school. All these random people just happen to have ended up in the same place and can't get away from each other for months at a time. So they're quite happy to see someone else and to talk about things. And sometimes you even get the sense they're telling you stuff that they haven't told their comrades because it just kind of didn't come up. Civilians is different. It's often a very unusual set of people who have chosen or proven to be unable to get out of those frontline areas.
My husband is now defending our country on the front line, and I'm defending the humanitarian front. Some here have nowhere to go. Some have disabled people at home. Some are pensioners who've accepted they might be killed here. We cannot leave them.
Sometimes there are people who you might suspect actually are waiting for the Russians to come, who have pro-Russian sympathies. Those people are often very wary of speaking to you.
You want to add to that, Aya?
In my last trip, we were driving through Velika Novosilica, this village that was not occupied itself, but was very close to villages that were occupied, about a 5-10 minute drive. And we were just driving around the village trying to find somebody to talk to. And we saw a woman in her bike, and we just waved at her like a camera, and she just screeched, stopped, and came to speak to us. And was very, very happy to share her opinion.
I was born here. This is where my story began. How can I leave? All my ancestors are buried here. Why should we give up Ukrainian land?
As we speak, sounds of artillery. Tatiana doesn't even flinch.
We have already adapted somehow, like there is some kind of mutation in our bodies. We don't react to explosions like that anymore.
As for soldiers, like Nick said, they're busy. And you two have been to positions where soldiers are in active combat. And that's why I really wanted to go to maybe a training situation where maybe they have a little bit more downtime and a little bit more, a space to reflect and really maybe speak to me a little bit longer. And in the last piece, I had a chance to speak to one trainer and really get into like the meta conversation about the counteroffensive and what he thinks of what politicians or experts are saying that it's going too slow.
Придут, покажут по делу, как это надо сделать. Проблема многих и политиков, и многих диванных экспертов, все красиво говорят.
So I think sometimes you also maybe want to try to catch soldiers to get really their perspective in different settings that might be less stressful, or where your interview has to get interrupted because, a drone is flying above you, or, you're getting fire back from, Russian positions.
Yeah, well, guys, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate your insights. And looking forward to your future reports. Be safe.